They called it the most fortified position in the Pacific before anyone even tried to breach it. 8 Marines trapped on Iwo Jima's northern cliffs, ammunition running low, Japanese forces advancing through 3 separate tunnel systems, and no hope of reinforcement, because every unit that had attempted to reach them either died or retreated in disarray. Staff Sergeant Maria Iron Santos keyed her radio one last time, her voice steady despite the impossible odds. "We're not leaving this position." But 400 meters away, Lieutenant Jake "Rocket" Morrison heard that transmission and did something that would either save 8 lives or add his name to the island's growing casualty list. He fired up his damaged F-4U Corsair and flew straight into a wall of anti-aircraft fire that had already claimed 6 aircraft that morning. Before we continue, let us know if you're enjoying this story in the comments, and if this grips you, make sure you're subscribed, because we've got even more incredible stories coming your way. 2 weeks earlier, Lieutenant Jake Morrison sat in the cramped briefing room aboard the USS Intrepid, his flight suit still reeking of aviation fuel from what would be his final authorized combat mission for the foreseeable future. Across the metal table, Captain William Sledgehammer Thompson shuffled through a stack of incident reports thick enough to stop shrapnel. His scarred face bore the expression of a man who'd watched too many good pilots make impulsive decisions that cost lives and aircraft. "Lieutenant Morrison," Thompson began, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades commanding. "Naval aviators, your actions during the Okinawa strike violated engagement protocols, endangered friendly forces, and resulted in the loss of approximately $75,000 worth of ordnance." Jake kept his eyes fixed on a rust stain spreading across the bulkhead. He'd memorized every imperfection in this compartment during the past 2 hours of disciplinary proceedings. Each stain reminded him of the blood he'd seen pooling beneath Corporal Tommy Rodriguez when he pulled him from that burning landing craft 3 days ago. The same landing craft that Command had classified as acceptable losses until Jake disobeyed orders and provided unauthorized close air support. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Captain Thompson's question hung in the recycled air like smoke from distant gun battles. Jake finally met his commanding officer's gaze. His blue eyes held no apology, no regret, just the unwavering resolve of someone who'd sleep soundly, knowing 12 Marines went home to their families instead of in body bags. "Sir, I'd do it again." Thompson's jaw tightened. He'd expected contrition, maybe some political maneuvering to save the lieutenant's career. Instead, he got the same stubborn integrity that made Jake Morrison the best close air support pilot in the squadron, and the biggest headache for anyone trying to manage him by the book. "Lieutenant Morrison, you're grounded pending full investigation. Your access to aircraft is revoked. Your weapons certification is suspended, and you'll report to the ship's administration for reassignment." He closed the folder with a decisive snap. "Dismissed." Jake stood, his boots clicking against the deck plates as he executed a regulation salute. He turned and walked toward the hatch, each step measured and deliberate. Behind him, he heard Thompson's aide whisper something about regulations and proper channels. Jake didn't look back. The flight deck of the USS Intrepid buzzed with controlled chaos that defined naval aviation operations. Jake pushed through the watertight door into the familiar cacophony of aircraft engines, catapult, launches, and recovery operations. His F-4U Corsair, Bureau number 97,264, sat secured in the aft section like a caged bird of prey. The aircraft's distinctive inverted gull wings and massive radial engine gave it an aggressive appearance, as if someone had crossed a shark with an eagle and taught it to hunt. Aviation machinists mate first class. Tony Wrench Kowalski looked up from a fuel pump inspection, his oil-stained coveralls and no-nonsense expression marking him as someone who'd forgotten more about aircraft maintenance than most people ever learned. He'd been keeping warbirds airworthy since before Jake graduated flight school, and his opinion carried more weight than most admirals. "Heard about your meeting with the old man?" Kowalski said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Figured you'd show up here sooner or later." Jake ran his hand along the Corsair's battle-scarred fuselage. The aircraft bore testimony to too many close calls. Too many missions where returning to the carrier counted as victory. bullet holes patched with aluminum, scorch marks from near-miss explosions, and stress fractures that spoke to the violence this machine had endured and survived. "They grounding her too?" Jake asked. Kowalski snorted. "Bird doesn't have a rank, Lieutenant. Can't court-martial an airplane." He wiped his hands on a shop rag that had seen better years. "But they did pull her from the active roster, scheduled for depot maintenance, probably ship her back to San Diego for complete overhaul." The two men stood in comfortable silence, both understanding what depot maintenance often meant. In Navy speak, it was frequently a polite way of saying an aircraft would be stripped for parts and scrapped. Jake's Corsair had flown too many impossible missions, absorbed too much damage, pushed too far. Beyond design specifications, Aviation Ordnanceman Second Class Carlos Boom Hernandez emerged from beneath the aircraft's starboard wing, his weathered face glistening with perspiration under the Pacific sun. Hernandez possessed the kind of mechanical intuition that bordered on supernatural. Give him a broken weapon system and a box of spare parts, and he'd find a way to make it deadly again. "Lieutenant," he nodded respectfully, "been giving your bird a complete inspection. She's got more patches than a quilt, but her bones are solid. Engine runs smooth, guns are clean, control surfaces respond perfectly." He paused, studying Jake's expression. "She wants to fight again." Jake knew Hernandez wasn't just talking about mechanical readiness. Aircraft developed personalities after enough combat missions, especially the Corsairs. They became partners rather than machines, developing quirks and characteristics that their pilots learned to read like facial expressions. "Any word on your reassignment?" Kowalski asked. Jake shook his head. "Probably end up pushing papers in some Pentagon basement, analyzing combat effectiveness reports for aircraft I'll never fly again." The flight deck's loudspeakers crackled to life, cutting through the ambient noise of maintenance work and flight operations. "Lieutenant Morrison, report to the Communications Center immediately." Lieutenant Morrison to Communications Center. Jake exchanged glances with Kowalski and Hernandez. Emergency communications usually meant something had gone wrong somewhere in the Pacific, and in this war, wrong had a way of escalating. Quickly, the Communications Center occupied a hardened compartment deep within the ship's superstructure, its steel bulkheads lined with radio equipment, radar displays, and communication terminals that never seemed to stop chattering. Radio Man First Class. Betty Sparks Chen sat at the primary console, her headset pressed tight against her ears as she worked to isolate a weak signal from atmospheric interference. "Lieutenant Morrison reporting as ordered," Jake announced to Lieutenant Commander Sarah Intel Hayes, the intelligence officer monitoring incoming reports. Hayes looked up from her plotting table, her expression troubled. "We've got a Marine unit in serious trouble. Iwo Jima, Northern Sector, 8-person reconnaissance patrol, surrounded by superior enemy, forces in prepared positions." Jake felt his pulse quicken. Iwo Jima was hell on earth, a volcanic island honeycomb with caves and tunnels that offered perfect defensive terrain. The Japanese had turned every ridge into a fortress, every cave into a bunker. Most pilots avoided close air support missions there unless absolutely necessary. "They're requesting immediate air support," Hayes continued, "but we've got complications. Weather's marginal, ceilings dropping, and the Japanese have concentrated anti-aircraft positions throughout the northern sector." Chen suddenly straightened in her chair, pressing her headset tighter. Her face went pale as she listened to whatever was coming through the static. She looked up at Hayes with the expression of someone who'd just heard a death sentence pronounced. "Ma'am, I'm getting fragmentary transmissions. Team leader reports they're taking casualties and running low on ammunition." Hayes grabbed the handset. "Eagle 8, this is Fleet Control. Do you copy?" Static answered her, punctuated by the distant sound of explosions. "Eagle 8, please respond." The silence stretched between them like an abyss. Jake knew what it meant. In the caves of Iwo Jima, lost communication usually meant lost lives. Without air support, a surrounded Marine patrol had two options: fight their way out or die trying. "What aircraft do we have available?" Jake asked. Hayes checked her status board. 2 Corsair flights are engaged in Fleet Air Defense Patrol. Another flight is providing combat air patrol over the landing zones. Closest available close air support is 90 minutes out, assuming weather conditions don't deteriorate further. Jake did the mathematics in his head. 90 minutes was eternity in ground combat, a surrounded unit burning through ammunition while enemy reinforcements poured through tunnel systems they'd spent months preparing. "There is one option," he said quietly. Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Lieutenant, you're grounded. Your aircraft isn't cleared for combat operations. The aircraft is mechanically sound. The pilot is available." The intelligence officer stared at Jake for a long moment, weighing regulations against reality. In the Navy, following orders kept careers intact, but sometimes breaking orders kept Marines alive. Chen's voice cut through their standoff. "Ma'am, I'm getting something." She adjusted her controls, trying to filter signal from atmospheric noise. A burst of static emerged from the speakers, followed by a voice so weak it barely qualified as human. "Any station, Eagle 8. We're not leaving this position." The transmission dissolved back into white noise, leaving the three officers staring at each other in the communications center's artificial light. Somewhere on Iwo Jima, 8 Marines were fighting for their lives, with no hope of rescue. The weather was too marginal for conventional aircraft, regulations prohibited unauthorized missions, and time was running out like water through a sieve. Jake turned toward the hatch without another word. He had a choice to make, and choices like this didn't improve with deliberation. Behind him, he heard Hayes quietly instruct Chen to maintain radio watch for any further transmissions. From Eagle 8, the walk back to the flight deck felt longer than usual, each step carrying the weight of what he was contemplating. Breaking orders again would end his career permanently. There would be no investigation, no second chances, no possibility of redemption. But careers were temporary things, while lives were irreplaceable. Kowalski looked up as Jake approached his aircraft. The chief petty officer had been around long enough to read expressions, and whatever he saw in Jake's face made him set down his tools and pay attention. "Tony, how long to get 264 ready for immediate launch?" Kowalski's eyes narrowed. "Lieutenant, you're not supposed to—" "How long?" Hernandez emerged from his workstation, wiping his hands on a clean rag. "Bird's fueled and armed from this morning's canceled mission. Pre-flight's current systems are green. She could be airborne in 20 minutes. Jake nodded, his decision crystallizing with the finality of a hatch slamming shut. "Then let's get her. Ready." Kowalski stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Jake, they'll crucify you. Court-martial, prison time, dishonorable discharge. Your flying days will be over." "They're already over," Jake replied. "Question is whether 8 Marines die because I was too worried about my career to do my job." The chief petty officer studied Jake's face for several heartbeats, then nodded once. "Boom. Prep the bird. Full combat load. Maximum fuel. Lieutenant Morrison is going flying." As the ground crew moved with practiced efficiency around his aircraft, Jake headed toward the pilot. Equipment locker to gear up. Each piece of equipment, flight suit, survival vest, helmet, oxygen mask, felt heavier than usual, weighted with the knowledge that this might be the last time he'd ever wear them. Outside the ship, storm clouds were building on the horizon, their dark masses promising the kind of weather that turned routine flights into survival exercises. Jake checked his watch. Eagle 8 had been out of contact for 18 minutes. In the tunnel systems of northern Iwo Jima, 18 minutes could mean the difference between rescue and recovery. He strapped himself into the Corsair's cockpit with the methodical precision of someone who'd performed this ritual hundreds of times. Each switch, each gauge, each control surface responded exactly as expected. The aircraft might be scarred and patched, but it was still fundamentally sound, still capable of delivering the kind of devastating firepower that could turn the tide of ground battles. The massive Pratt & Whitney radial engine coughed to life with its characteristic rumble, vibrating through the airframe like controlled thunder. Jake ran through his pre-flight checks one final time, knowing that any mechanical failure over Iwo Jima would likely be fatal for both him and the trapped Marines. "Tower, Corsair 264 requesting immediate launch. Emergency departure." The air controller's voice crackled through his headset. 264, you're not on today's flight schedule. Please state the nature of your emergency." Jake keyed his microphone. "Eagle 8 is in contact and requesting immediate close air support. I'm responding." A long pause followed, filled only by the sound of his engine and the distant rumble of flight operations. The controller was undoubtedly checking his computer, seeing Jake's grounded status, weighing his own. Career against the lives of 8 Marines. 264, you are cleared for immediate launch. Wind is 270 at 20, gusts to 30. Weather deteriorating to the north, good hunting. Jake released his brakes and taxied toward the catapult, leaving behind the ordered world of naval regulations and entering the chaotic realm where decisions were measured in lives rather than careers. The catapult shot hurled his Corsair off the deck with the violence of controlled explosion. Jake felt the familiar sensation of the aircraft transforming from deck-bound machine to airborne predator. Below him, the USS Intrepid shrank to insignificance against the vast blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean. He banked north toward Iwo Jima, climbing through scattered clouds that grew darker and more threatening with each passing mile. His radio altimeter showed the water falling away beneath him as he gained altitude, but ahead lay an island that had already consumed thousands of American lives and showed no signs of mercy. The radio crackled with routine traffic from other aircraft in the area. Transport planes flying wounded back to hospital ships, fighter patrols maintaining air superiority over the invasion beaches, reconnaissance flights gathering intelligence on Japanese positions. None of them were heading where he was going. None of them were stupid enough to fly single ship into the most heavily defended airspace in the Pacific. Jake switched to the emergency frequency and transmitted in the blind. Eagle 8, this is Corsair 264, inbound your position. If you can hear this transmission, key your radio twice. Static answered him, punctuated by occasional bursts of interference from the electrical storm building ahead. He tried again, adjusting his radio settings to compensate for atmospheric disturbance. Still nothing. 32 minutes had passed since Eagle 8's last transmission. In Jake's experience, units that went silent usually stayed that way, either because they were overrun or because their tactical situation had deteriorated to the point where radio discipline meant survival. The silhouette of Iwo Jima appeared through the haze like a vision from hell. The island's volcanic peaks rose from the ocean like broken teeth, their slopes scarred by weeks of bombardment and close combat. Smoke drifted from countless shell craters and burning positions, creating a pall that obscured much of the northern sector. Jake's navigation system showed his current position relative to Eagle 8's last known coordinates. 10 more minutes of flight time, assuming the weather held and the Japanese anti-aircraft guns didn't find their mark first. Through his canopy, he could see the storm front moving south from the northern Pacific like a gray wall of violence. Staff Sergeant Maria Iron Santos pressed her back against the cold volcanic rock and tried to control her, breathing. Blood seeped through the improvised bandage wrapped around her right thigh, the result of shrapnel from a mortar round that had nearly ended her war 30 minutes ago. Around her, the 7 remaining members of her reconnaissance patrol huddled in whatever cover they could find. The cave system offered protection from direct fire, but little else. Its mouth faced west toward the beach, providing a clear view of American positions below, but also exposing them to Japanese observers who had undoubtedly marked their location. The same tunnel network that offered concealment also provided the enemy with multiple approach routes, turning their defensive position into a potential trap. Corporal Danny Scope Wilson lay prone near the cave entrance, his M1 rifle trained on distant movement among the volcanic rocks. Blood matted the hair above his left ear where a sniper's bullet had grazed his skull during the initial ambush. Despite the wound, his hands remained steady, his breathing controlled, his focus absolute. Movement, 2 o'clock, approximately 300 yards, Wilson whispered into his throat microphone. Multiple individuals using the lava tubes for concealment. Hospital corpsman. Mike Doc Riley looked up from the unconscious form of Private First Class Tommy Kid Nakamura. The youngest member of their patrol had taken the worst of the initial enemy fire, a rifle round that had entered his left shoulder and exited near his spine. Riley had managed to stabilize the bleeding, but Nakamura needed surgery, and soon. "How's he looking, Doc?" Santos asked. Riley's expression told the story before he spoke. "He's lost a lot of blood. I've got him stable for now, but without an aid station." He left the sentence unfinished. Private First Class. Jack Radio Murphy crouched beside his damaged communication equipment, surrounded by a tangle of wires and vacuum tubes. The radio had taken a direct hit during the ambush, its case cracked and its antenna array reduced to twisted metal. Murphy had been working on repairs for the past hour, cannibalizing parts from other equipment in a desperate attempt to restore communication. "Any luck with the comms?" Santos inquired. Murphy shook his head. "Main transmitter is fried. I might be able to jury-rig something using the backup battery pack, but range will be limited and battery life won't last long." Santos checked her watch. They'd been trapped in this position for 57 minutes, and their tactical situation was deteriorating steadily. Nakamura needed medical attention, their ammunition was running low, and the Japanese seemed content to wait them out rather than press a direct assault. That last point worried her most. In her experience, Japanese forces usually attacked aggressively, either because they sought to overrun American positions quickly or because they feared being caught in the open by artillery and air support. The fact that these forces were exercising patience suggested they either had intelligence about American response capabilities or were preparing for something larger. "Scope, what do you make of their movement patterns?" Santos asked. Wilson adjusted his rifle sight, studying enemy positions through his telescopic optic. "They're not behaving like typical bonsai fighters, too disciplined, too coordinated. Someone's controlling their movement from a position I can't identify." That confirmed Santos's suspicions. This wasn't a chance encounter with a roving patrol. This was a planned ambush, probably based on intelligence about their reconnaissance route. Someone had known they were coming. The sound of approaching aircraft engines echoed off the volcanic walls, faint but unmistakable. All 8 Marines looked skyward, hope and caution warring in their expressions. Aircraft meant potential close air support, but it also meant potential target practice for Japanese anti-aircraft guns. "That's not Navy," Murphy observed, his trained ear parsing the engine signature. "Sounds like a single engine, probably a fighter. Corsair, maybe." Santos felt a flicker of hope. Single-engine fighters usually meant close air support, the kind of precise firepower that could break up enemy concentrations and provide cover for withdrawal. But the weather was deteriorating rapidly, and most pilots wouldn't risk flying single ship into known anti-aircraft positions. Wilson suddenly stiffened behind his rifle scope. "I've got multiple heat signatures moving through the tunnel system. Approximately 200 yards out looks like a coordinated assault." Santos swore under her breath. More enemy forces meant their already desperate situation was about to become impossible. Whatever aircraft was approaching had better be ready for the fight of its life. Jake flew through the approaches to northern Iwo Jima at 1,500 feet above sea level, his Corsair bucking and rolling in the turbulent air. The volcanic landscape stretched below him like the surface of an alien world, all sharp ridges and deep shadows, devoid of vegetation or any sign that human beings had ever lived there peacefully. His eyes swept constantly between his instruments and the terrain below, searching for any sign of the missing Marine patrol. The tactical frequency crackled with fragmentary transmissions from other units engaged across the island, but nothing from Eagle 8 Corsair 264, overhead your last known position. If you can hear this transmission, pop smoke or signal your location. Nothing but static answered him. Jake banked left, following the contour of the ridgeline as he searched for any indication of friendly forces. The terrain below looked like photographs from the moon, all craters and broken rock, scoured clean by weeks of bombardment. A glint of reflected light caught his attention, sunlight bouncing off metal or glass somewhere among the volcanic formations. Jake banked toward the reflection, dropping to 1,000 feet as he tried to identify its source. Through his gun sight, he could make out what appeared to be equipment scattered among the rocks. "Eagle 8, I have eyes on what appears to be military equipment at grid reference." Jake rattled off the coordinates while marking the position on his plotting board. "Confirm your location if able." This time, he thought he heard something beneath the static, a brief burst of sound that might have been a human voice. He circled back, flying a tight orbit around the suspected position while scanning for movement or additional signs of life. Movement caught his eye, not from the equipment location, but from a series of cave openings several hundred yards to the east. Through his gun sight, he He could see figures moving between concealed positions, their actions suggesting hostile intent rather than distress. Jake armed his 50 caliber machine guns and selected armor-piercing rounds, the 6 Browning M2. Machine guns mounted in his wings were devastatingly effective against infantry in the open, capable of punching through light armor and fortified positions with equal efficiency. His gun sight acquired the moving figures and painted them with targeting information, but rules of engagement required positive identification of hostile intent before opening fire. Heat signatures and suspicious movement weren't enough to justify lethal force. The decision was made for him when muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions among the caves, tracer rounds arcing upward toward his aircraft in streams of deadly light. Several rounds passed close, enough to his cockpit that he could hear them crack past his canopy. Jake rolled inverted and pulled through a diving attack, lining up his guns on the largest concentration of muzzle flashes. The 6.50 caliber machine guns roared to life with a sound like industrial machinery. Possessed by demons, their rounds walking across the volcanic terrain in a line of destruction that shattered rock and silenced several enemy positions. He pulled up hard, climbing back to attacking altitude while assessing the damage below. Several of the cave positions had fallen silent, but others continued firing, their tracers reaching up toward him like deadly fireworks. Jake's radio crackled with a weak but unmistakable human voice. "Corsair 264, this is Eagle 8 actual." Relief flooded through him as Santos's voice came through his headset, clearly despite the static. They were alive, they were conscious, and they were close enough for radio contact. "Eagle 8 actual, copy your transmission. Can you mark your position with smoke or visual signal?" "Negative on smoke," Santos replied, her voice tight with strain. "We're in a defensive position and cannot risk revealing our exact location. Be advised, we have enemy forces preparing for coordinated assault on our position." Jake checked his fuel gauge and ammunition status. He had approximately 40 minutes of flight time remaining and full loads of 50 caliber ammunition. Enough time and firepower to break up an enemy. Assault, but not enough to provide sustained close air support if the situation dragged on. "Eagle 8, understood. I'm going to work on the assault force first, then we'll coordinate your extraction." He banked east, following the ridgeline as he searched for the advancing enemy forces. His practiced eye picked out movement among the lava tubes and cave systems, too organized to be random, too. Numerous to be anything other than a coordinated military operation. Jake selected his remaining armor-piercing rounds and began his attack run, diving toward the moving formations at an angle that would allow him to rake their entire advance with machine gun fire. The enemy had minimal cover in the open volcanic terrain, no protection from the devastating firepower of a Corsair in full attack mode. The 6 machine guns spoke again, their combined voice echoing off the volcanic walls like thunder from an angry god. Dust and debris erupted along the enemy approach routes as 50 caliber rounds tore through rock and flesh with equal efficiency. The coordinated advance dissolved into chaos, surviving fighters scrambling for whatever cover they could find among the lava formations. But Jake's attack had revealed his position and attack pattern to other enemy forces hidden throughout the sector. As he pulled up from his strafing run, anti-aircraft fire erupted from positions he hadn't even seen, filling the air around his aircraft with tracer rounds and the distinctive black puffs of flak explosions. One shell burst close enough to his starboard wing that he could feel the concussion through the aircraft structure. Shrapnel rattled against his fuselage like hail, and warning lights began flickering across his instrument panel. Another burst detonated directly below his aircraft, close enough to lift his Corsair several hundred feet and fill the cockpit with the acrid smell of cordite. Jake jinked hard left, then right, using the Corsair's legendary strength and his own flying skills to avoid the worst of the anti-aircraft fire. But he knew he couldn't maintain evasive maneuvers indefinitely. The Japanese had too many guns in too many positions, and eventually one of them would find their mark. "Eagle 8, I'm taking heavy flak from multiple positions. I need you to identify the biggest threats so I can prioritize targets." Santos's voice was replaced by Wilson's steady observation. "I've got eyes on a heavy anti-aircraft position at your 10 o'clock, approximately 500 meters from your last attack run. They've got you ranged and are tracking your movements." Jake rolled left and dove toward the indicated position, his gun sight painting crosshairs on a carefully concealed flak position. Through the drifting smoke, he could see the distinctive silhouette of a Japanese 25mm anti-aircraft gun, its crew working frantically to bring their weapon to bear on his diving aircraft. This time, he selected high-explosive rounds, ammunition designed to destroy equipment and eliminate crew-served weapons. The machine guns fired a longer burst, their rounds impacting with devastating accuracy around the flak position. The anti-aircraft gun fell silent, its crew eliminated by the concentrated firepower. But Jake's celebration was short-lived as his aircraft shuddered under the impact of a direct flak hit. His port engine began streaming black smoke, oil pressure dropped precipitously, and his flight controls became heavy and unresponsive. Warning lights illuminated his instrument panel like a Christmas tree, indicating damage to multiple systems. The Corsair was designed to absorb battle damage and return to base, but there were limits to what even the most robust aircraft could endure. Jake was flying on borrowed time, and he knew it. Eagle 8, I'm showing battle damage and may have to break contact soon. What's your status on? Withdrawal? Santos keyed her radio, her voice strained but determined. Negative on withdrawal. We've got one. Urgent surgical case. And movement would expose us to direct fire from positions you can't suppress with available ordnance. Jake checked his fuel gauge again. 30 minutes of flight time remaining, possibly less with engine. Damage reducing efficiency. Not enough time to wait for conventional rescue forces, and the weather was continuing to deteriorate. If he was going to save these Marines, it would have to be now, while he still had an aircraft capable of flight. The storm struck with the suddenness of Pacific weather, transforming the already dangerous airspace into a meteorological nightmare. Jake found himself flying through walls of rain that hammered his damaged canopy like machine gun fire, visibility dropping to near zero as the world became a gray curtain of water and turbulence. His aircraft bucked and rolled in violent air currents, the Corsair's strong construction fighting to maintain controlled flight in the chaotic atmosphere. Lightning forked across the sky in brilliant electric webs close enough that he could smell ozone through his oxygen system. Below in their cave position, the Marines felt the storm's fury as a constant drumbeat against volcanic stone. Water cascaded down the cliff faces in temporary waterfalls, pooling in the cave entrance and soaking their equipment. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, turning their breath into visible vapor. "Doc, how's Nakamura holding up?" Santos shouted over the sound of wind and rain echoing through the cave system. Riley checked his patient's pulse and breathing, his medical training automatically compensating for the difficult conditions. Nakamura's skin was pale and clammy, his breathing shallow but steady. The improvised pressure bandages were holding, but blood loss and shock were taking their inevitable toll. "He's stable but deteriorating," Riley replied. "I've given him all the morphine I can safely administer." Without proper surgical facilities. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Murphy worked frantically on his radio equipment, trying to maintain contact with the Corsair circling somewhere above the storm. The backup transmitter signal was weak under normal conditions, and the electrical activity in the atmosphere was wreaking havoc with radio propagation. "Corsair 264, Eagle 8 actual, how do you read?" Murphy transmitted, adjusting frequency settings in hopes of punching through the interference. Static answered him, punctuated by electronic squeals that indicated severe atmospheric disturbance. He tried again on different frequencies, methodically working through the emergency spectrum. Wilson suddenly raised his hand for silence, his acute hearing detecting something beneath the storms. Cacophony. "Aircraft engines," he whispered, "close, maybe directly overhead." They all listened, straining to hear over the wind and rain. There it was, the distinctive sound of a radial engine running rough, rising and falling as the aircraft maneuvered in the violent air. Jake was still up. There, still flying in conditions that would have grounded most pilots. "He's insane," Murphy muttered with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "Flying in this weather is suicide." Santos keyed her radio again. "Corsair 264, we can hear your engine. You need to get out of this storm before it kills you." Jake's voice came through with startling clarity, the radio signal cutting through static with determined resolution. "Eagle 8, Negative on departure. I'm not abandoning Marines to die in a cave. Above the storm, Jake fought to maintain control of his crippled aircraft. The engine damage had worsened, forcing him to reduce power and accept degraded performance that made flying in turbulence even more dangerous. His fuel situation was approaching critical, 15 minutes of flight time, remaining under current consumption rates. The lightning presented his greatest immediate threat. Each electrical discharge created electromagnetic pulses that interfered with his navigation systems and threatened to destroy his radio equipment entirely. He'd already lost his compass, and his fuel gauge was giving erratic readings. But during his low-level reconnaissance, he'd discovered something that changed the tactical equation completely. Hidden in a narrow valley approximately 1 kilometer from the Marines' position was what appeared to be a Japanese supply depot, flat ground, partially sheltered from observation, and most importantly, large enough for an aircraft to attempt an emergency landing. The problem was getting there. The route from the cave to the potential landing site led directly through territory now occupied by enemy forces who seemed remarkably well prepared for American air operations. They had concentrated anti-aircraft weapons, disciplined fire control, and positions that commanded all obvious approach routes. Jake keyed his radio. Eagle 8 Actual, I've located a potential extraction site approximately 1 click southeast of your position. It's going to require movement through enemy-controlled terrain. Copy that, Corsair. What kind of opposition are we looking at? Jake consulted his plotting board, mentally cataloging the enemy positions he'd identified during previous attack runs. I count at least 12 confirmed anti-aircraft positions between your location and the extraction site. Heavy machine guns, 25mm cannon, probably some mortars based on the crater patterns I observed. Santos absorbed this information while studying the tactical situation from her limited vantage point. Moving wounded personnel through 1 kilometer of enemy-controlled terrain would be difficult under the best circumstances. In a storm, with limited ammunition and no guarantee of close air support, it bordered on impossible. What about suppressive fire? Santos asked. Can you clear us a path? Jake checked his ammunition status. He had approximately 400 rounds of .50 caliber remaining, enough for perhaps 2 sustained attack runs. Against 12 prepared positions, it wouldn't be sufficient to eliminate all threats. I can suppress some positions, but I don't have enough ammunition to clear the entire route. You're going to have to fight through part of it. The brutal mathematics of their situation became clear to everyone listening. They could remain in the cave and hope for rescue that might never come, or they could attempt a fighting withdrawal through superior enemy forces with minimal air support. Neither option offered good odds of survival. Wilson spoke up from his position near the cave entrance. I'm seeing movement out there. Looks like they're repositioning, probably trying to get closer before the storm breaks. Santos made her decision with the cold logic that had kept her alive through 2 Pacific campaigns. Corsair 264, we're going to try for the extraction site. I need you to hit the positions between us and the valley mouth first, then work your way southeast. Copy that, Eagle 8. Give me 2 minutes to line up my attack run. Jake rolled into a steep dive, descending through the storm clouds toward the volcanic terrain below. Rain hammered his damaged canopy with increasing intensity as he dropped altitude, the aircraft's airspeed indicator fluctuating wildly as he fought through wind shear and turbulence. His gun sight struggled to acquire targets through the rain and atmospheric interference. Heat signatures were scattered and inconsistent, obscured by the cooling effect of precipitation. He would have to rely on visual identification and his memory of enemy positions from earlier reconnaissance. At 800 feet above ground level, he broke through the worst of the storm clouds and could see the volcanic landscape spread below him. Muzzle flashes sparkled among the rocks like deadly stars, marking enemy positions that were engaging targets he couldn't see. Probably the Marines beginning their movement. Jake selected his remaining armor-piercing rounds and lined up his attack run on the largest concentration of enemy fire. The 6 machine guns thundered to life, their distinctive sound momentarily, drowning out even the storm's fury. Rock exploded and dust.